My call sign is Widow 6.
Widow 6, we need you.
Ma'am, please sit down. You don't know what you're talking about. The flight attendant rolled her eyes at the old woman. Just relax, everything is fine. 2 minutes later, the engine exploded. Then F-35 pilots radioed, Widow 6 on board. The attendant's face went white. She had no idea. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez. We've been cleared for takeoff. Flight time to Miami will be approximately 4 hours and 37 minutes. We're expecting smooth air most of the way, with maybe a little chop over the Carolinas. Sit back, relax, and we'll have you on the ground before you know it. The Boeing 737 roared down the runway, the acceleration pressing Margaret back into her seat. Rotate. Gear up. Flaps retracted. The familiar choreography played out exactly as it should. She opened her eyes and glanced out the window at the snow-capped mountains falling away beneath them. 20 minutes into the flight, Margaret felt it before she heard it. A vibration. Wrong. Too much frequency in the left engine. She sat up straighter, her hand gripping the armrest. The businessman beside her stirred but didn't wake. The college student never looked up from her phone. Margaret counted. The vibration came in waves, every 12 seconds. That meant a compressor blade issue, probably in the 3rd stage. Not critical yet, but it would be. Soon. She pressed the call button. A flight attendant appeared, a young man named Derek with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He looked tired, like he'd worked too many shifts in a row. Yes, ma'am. Can I get you something to drink? I need you to inform the captain that he has a compressor blade resonance in the left engine, Margaret said quietly. 3rd stage, based on the frequency pattern. He should consider shutting it down before it becomes critical. Derek's smile froze. He looked at her like she'd just started speaking in tongues. Ma'am, I'm sure everything is fine. The pilots would know if. The pilots haven't noticed yet because the vibration is subtle and the engine instruments won't show the problem until the blade actually fails, Margaret interrupted, keeping her voice calm and level. When it does fail, pieces of titanium will go through the engine like shrapnel. At this altitude and speed, that could be catastrophic. Derek's face had gone from confused to annoyed. Another nervous passenger, his expression said. Another person who watched too many airplane disaster movies. Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but our pilots are highly trained professionals. If there was a problem, they would. The plane shuddered. It wasn't much. Just a slight bump, like hitting a patch of rough air. But Margaret knew better. That was the vibration intensifying, the compressor blade developing a crack that would soon become a full fracture. That wasn't turbulence, Margaret said, her voice taking on an edge of authority that made Derek step back. You have maybe 10 minutes before that engine tears itself apart. Get the captain on the intercom. Now. Derek's jaw tightened. Ma'am, you need to calm down. You're disrupting other passengers. I'm trying to save their lives, Margaret said flatly. The college student had finally pulled out her earbuds, looking between Margaret and Derek with wide eyes. The businessman was awake now too, frowning. Is there a problem? The businessman asked, his tone suggesting that Margaret was the problem. No, sir, Derek said quickly. Just a nervous passenger, nothing to worry about. Margaret stood up, her 5'2" frame somehow commanding attention in the cramped aisle. My name is Margaret Chen. I have 14,000 hours in 737s, 22,000 hours in military aircraft, and I'm telling you that this plane is about to have a catastrophic engine failure. Derek's eyes widened, but not with belief. With alarm. A crazy old woman was causing a scene. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to sit down and. The plane shuddered again, harder this time. Several overhead bins popped open. A woman 3 rows back screamed. The engine noise had changed too, developing a high-pitched whine that made Margaret's teeth ache. "Listen to that sound," Margaret said urgently. "That's metal grinding against metal. You're out of time." Derek grabbed the intercom phone, but not to call the cockpit. "We have a disruptive passenger in 14C, he said. "I may need assistance." The explosion wasn't as loud as people might expect. It was more of a deep, resonating whomp that Margaret felt in her chest. The plane yawned hard to the left, throwing everyone who was standing to the floor. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. The cabin filled with screams. Margaret grabbed her mask and pulled it on, her hands steady despite the chaos around her. She looked out the window. The left engine was trailing smoke and flames, pieces of the cowling hanging loose and flapping in the wind. The intercom crackled to life. The captain's voice, trying to sound calm but failing. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've experienced an engine failure. Please remain calm. We're perfectly capable of flying on one engine. We're going to level off and return to Seattle. Everything is under control." But Margaret could feel that everything was not under control. The plane was yawing too hard. The rudder wasn't trimming properly. The captain was fighting the aircraft, and the aircraft was winning. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up again. This time, Derek didn't try to stop her. He was clutching a seat back, his face white as paper. "I need to get to the cockpit," Margaret said. That's not possible," Derek stammered. "The door is locked in." "Then unlock it. Because in about 2 minutes, this plane is going to enter an uncontrolled roll, and your captain doesn't have the experience to recover from it." Another flight attendant appeared from the forward galley, an older woman named Patricia with gray streaks in her dark hair and the look of someone who had seen everything twice. She took one look at the smoking engine through a window, then at Margaret's calm, focused face, then at Derek's panicked one. "Who are you?" Patricia asked Margaret directly. "Retired Air Force, test pilot. I flew the early 737 prototypes for Boeing after my military service. I know this aircraft inside and out." Patricia made a decision in that moment. Maybe it was the absolute certainty in Margaret's voice. Maybe it was the steady hands when everyone else was shaking. Maybe it was just instinct. "Come with me," Patricia said. They moved forward through the cabin, past passengers who were crying, praying, clutching each other. A man grabbed Margaret's sleeve as she passed. "Are we going to die?" he asked, his voice cracking. Margaret stopped and looked him in the eye. "Not if I can help it." Patricia used her key to unlock the cockpit door and knocked twice. "Captain Rodriguez, we have a situation." "Not now," came the sharp reply from inside. "We're declaring an emergency. Sir, we have a passenger who says she's a pilot. She predicted the engine failure before it happened." A pause. Then, "What?" Patricia opened the door. The cockpit was a controlled chaos of flashing lights and warning alarms. Captain Rodriguez, a man in his mid-40s with sweat beading on his forehead, turned to look at Margaret. His co-pilot, a young woman named Sarah Chen, no relation to Margaret, was on the radio, her voice tight with stress. "Seattle Center, Coastal 447, we have lost Engine 1, experiencing severe control issues, requesting priority landing at the nearest suitable airport." Captain Rodriguez looked Margaret up and down. Grandmotherly cardigan, reading glasses, gray hair. His expression hardened. "Ma'am, you can't be in here. This is a restricted area." "Your rudder actuator is failing," Margaret said, ignoring his dismissal. "That's why you can't hold heading. The engine failure created a vibration that damaged the hydraulic line to the rudder controls. You're losing fluid pressure, and in approximately 90 seconds, you'll have no rudder authority at all." Rodriguez stared at her. "How could you possibly?" "Because I helped design the hydraulic routing on this generation of 737s, Margaret said. And I'm telling you that if you don't switch to the backup hydraulic system right now, you're going to lose directional control completely. Sarah looked up from the radio, her face pale. Captain, the rudder pressure gauge is dropping. She's right. Rodriguez hesitated. Everything in his training, in his authority as captain, told him to remove this passenger from his cockpit. But the plane was getting harder to control by the second. The yaw was increasing. And this old woman had just diagnosed a problem he hadn't even identified yet. "Who are you?" he demanded. "My name is Margaret Chen. Colonel, United States Air Force, retired. I have over 40,000 flight hours. I've flown everything from Cessnas to experimental stealth aircraft. And right now, I'm the most qualified person on this plane to get us safely on the ground." "This is insane," Rodriguez said, but his hands were already moving, switching the hydraulic selectors to the backup system. Immediately, the rudder response improved. The plane steadied slightly. "Seattle Center, Coastal 447, Sarah continued on the radio, we're now declaring a full emergency. We need emergency equipment standing by and we're requesting." "Captain, where are we diverting to?" Rodriguez looked at Margaret. "You seem to know everything. Where should we go?" Margaret was already studying the navigation display. McCord Air Force Base that's 23 miles northeast. Long runway, emergency equipment, and most importantly, I know it like the back of my hand. I flew in and out of there for 15 years. "We can't just land at a military base without clearance," Rodriguez protested. "You're in an emergency. They'll clear us." "Sarah, tell Seattle Center we're diverting to McCord. Give them our position and tell them we need a straight-in approach to runway 16. Sarah looked at her captain. Rodriguez, his face conflicted, finally nodded. As Sarah relayed the information, Margaret moved closer to the instrument panel. She didn't touch anything, but her eyes scanned every gauge, every indicator, every warning light. She was reading the aircraft like a book written in a language only she fully understood. "Your hydraulic pressure is holding for now, but it's not going to last," she said. "You've got maybe 15 minutes before the backup system fails too. That's enough time to get us on the ground, but only if we do everything right the first time. No second chances." Rodriguez was sweating heavily now. I've never landed with this kind of damage before." "I have," Margaret said quietly. 3 times, once in a combat zone with half the tail shot off. This is manageable, Captain, but you need to trust me. The radio crackled with a new voice. Male, calm, with the unmistakable clip of military precision. Coastal 447, McCord Tower. We have you on radar. We're clearing all traffic. You're priority 1. Say souls on board and fuel remaining. Sarah responded, McCord Tower, Coastal 447, 147 souls on board, fuel for approximately 2 hours. Copy, 447. Emergency equipment is rolling. Runway 16 is yours. Winds are 210 at 8 knots. Altimeter 3012. Margaret leaned toward the radio. McCord Tower, Coastal 447. Request you have 2 F-18s on standby, meet us for a visual inspection of our damage. There was a pause. Coastal 447, who is speaking? Rodriguez looked at Margaret in confusion. Why do we need fighters? Because I can't see the full extent of the damage from here, Margaret explained. And we need to know exactly what we're working with before we attempt to land. McCord has alert fighters. They can be wheels up in 5 minutes. The tower came back, Coastal 447, what is your request? Margaret took the co-pilot's microphone. McCord Tower, this is Colonel Margaret Chen, USAF retired, currently assisting the crew of Coastal 447. We need a visual inspection of our damage. Request 2 fighters for flyby and assessment. Another, longer pause. Coastal 447, please confirm. Did you say Colonel Chin? Affirmative, Tower. There was something in the controller's voice now. Surprise. Maybe even excitement. Colonel, stand by one. Rodriguez was staring at Margaret. What just happened? I have a reputation in certain circles, Margaret said simply. The radio came alive again, but this time it was a different voice. Older, commanding, with the weight of authority behind every word. Coastal 447, this is General Marcus Reeves, Wing Commander at McCord. Colonel Chen, is that really you? Margaret smiled slightly. Hello, Marcus. It's been a while. 13 years since you retired, Reeves said, and there was warmth in his voice now. We thought you were living the quiet life. Growing vegetables or something. I am. Was, until today. Marcus, I need those fighters. We have significant damage and I need eyes on the underside of this aircraft before we attempt landing. Already scrambling them. Hawks 1 and 2 will be on your wing in 3 minutes. Colonel. He paused. It's good to hear your voice again. We've got you. Whatever you need. Captain Rodriguez was looking at Margaret with a completely different expression now. Not dismissal. Not annoyance. Something closer to awe. Who are you? He asked again, but this time it was a genuine question. Someone who should have introduced herself better, Margaret admitted. But we didn't have time for pleasantries. And we still don't. Captain, I need you to do exactly what I say, when I say it. Can you do that? Rodriguez swallowed hard and nodded. Yes, ma'am. 3 minutes later, exactly as promised, 2 F-18 Super Hornets appeared off their left wing, sleek gray shapes cutting through the air with predatory grace. Margaret felt a familiar thrill seeing them. She had flown their predecessors, back when her hair wasn't gray and her hands didn't shake in the cold. The radio crackled. Coastal 447, Hawk 1. We're on your wing. Good to see you're still flying, Colonel. Margaret keyed the mic. Hawk 1, good to have you. I need a complete visual inspection. Start with the left engine and work aft. Pay special attention to the empennage and the wing root. I'm concerned about structural damage from the engine debris. Copy, Colonel. Coming around. The two fighters split up, one sliding underneath the damaged 737 while the other climbed above. They moved with a precision that was beautiful to watch, even in the midst of an emergency. Rodriguez was maintaining altitude and heading as best he could, but Margaret could see the strain on his face. Every few seconds, he had to make a correction, fighting the asymmetric thrust and the degrading flight controls. Hawk 1 to Coastal 447, the fighter pilot's voice came back, and there was a new tension in it. Colonel, you've got some significant damage. Your left engine is completely destroyed. The cowling is mostly gone. But that's not the worst of it. You've got impact damage to your left horizontal stabilizer. Looks like engine debris punched several holes through it. I can see hydraulic fluid streaming from at least 2 locations. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. That was worse than she'd thought. Any wing damage? She asked. Negative. Wing looks intact. But Colonel, that stabilizer. I don't know how you're going to land this. We'll manage, Margaret said with more confidence than she felt. Hawk 1, I need you to stay on our wing all the way down. You're going to be my eyes on the approach. Can you do that? Ma'am, we'd follow you through the gates of hell if you asked. Margaret turned back to Rodriguez. His hands were white-knuckled on the yoke. Captain, I need you to listen very carefully. What I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I've done it before. That stabilizer damage means we've lost most of our pitch control. The elevator is probably partially jammed. That means we can't flare normally on landing. Then how do we? Rodriguez's voice trailed off. We're going to come in hot and fast. Much faster than normal. 170 knots over the threshold instead of the usual 130. We're going to use engine thrust to control our descent rate instead of the elevator. It's going to be the hardest landing you've ever made, but it's going to be survivable. Sarah, the co-pilot, spoke up for the first time in minutes. I've read about that technique. It's in the emergency procedures, but it's listed as last resort only. They say the landing gear might not be able to handle the impact forces. They might not, Margaret agreed. But the alternative is losing control on final and crashing short of the runway. This way, we have a chance. Rodriguez was shaking his head. I don't know if I can do this. You're not going to, Margaret said gently. I am. What? Rodriguez looked at her in shock. Captain, you're a good pilot. I can see that. But you've never landed an aircraft with this kind of damage. I have. I need you to let me take the controls. That's against every regulation. I'm the pilot in command. I can't just. You can, Margaret interrupted. This is an emergency. You have the authority to accept any assistance necessary to ensure the safety of your passengers. That includes letting a more experienced pilot take the controls. Rodriguez looked at Sarah. The young co-pilot met his eyes and gave him a small nod. She's right, Captain. We're in over our heads. For a long moment, Rodriguez sat frozen, wrestling with his pride, his training, his sense of responsibility. Then, slowly, he released the yoke and unbuckled his harness. The aircraft is yours, Colonel, he said quietly. Margaret slid into the captain's seat, her hands wrapping around the yoke with a familiarity that transcended the 13 years since she'd last flown. The aircraft spoke to her through the controls, telling her everything she needed to know through pressure and resistance and subtle movements. How does it feel? Sarah asked. Like riding a bicycle, Margaret said. A bicycle that's on fire and missing a wheel. But still like a bicycle. She keyed the intercom to the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, this is, well, I suppose I should introduce myself properly. My name is Margaret Chen. I'm a retired Air Force pilot, and I'm going to be helping Captain Rodriguez land this aircraft. I won't lie to you, we've got some significant damage and this is going to be a rough landing. But I've done this before, and I'm going to get us all home safely. I need everyone to listen to the flight attendants, get into the brace position when instructed, and trust me. We're going to be fine. Margaret began her descent, her hands moving with practiced precision over the controls. Every input was deliberate, economical, exactly what was needed and nothing more. McCord Tower, Coastal 447, beginning our approach for runway 16. Copy, 447. Winds now 220 at 10 gusting to 15. Runway is clear. All emergency equipment is standing by. Understood, Tower. Margaret glanced at the fuel gauges. We're going to get one shot at this. Sarah, I need you to configure the aircraft. Flaps 5. Sarah moved the flap lever. The plane shuddered as the flaps extended slightly, increasing drag and lift. How's that feel? Sarah asked. Like dragging an anchor, but that's what we want. We need to slow down but maintain control. Gear down. Gear down, Sarah confirmed, pulling the gear lever. They felt the clunk of the landing gear extending, followed by 3 green lights indicating all gears were locked. Hawk 1, confirmed 3 down and locked, Margaret said. The fighter pilot, who had stayed glued to their wing through the entire descent, moved in for a closer look. Affirmative, Colonel. All 3 are down and locked. Though I gotta say, those tires are going to have a hell of a day when you touch down at this speed. They've had worse, Margaret replied. Flaps 15, Sarah. The plane slowed further as more flaps extended. Margaret was constantly adjusting thrust, playing the throttle on the remaining right engine like a musical instrument. Too much power and they'd climb. Too little and they'd sink like a stone. The damaged stabilizer made every adjustment critical. Rodriguez, standing behind them now, was gripping the back of Sarah's seat so hard his knuckles were white. "How are you doing this?" he breathed. "Practice," Margaret said. "Lots and lots of practice, most of it unplanned." Coastal 447, this is General Reeves. "Colonel, I've got half the base watching you on radar. You're flying that approach like you wrote the textbook on it." "I helped write the chapter on emergency procedures for damaged 737s, Margaret said. "Back in 1994. After that incident over the Pacific." There was a pause. "You were the pilot on that flight? The one where the cargo door blew off?" "That was me. Lost 30 feet of fuselage, half my hydraulics, and all my coffee, still mad about the coffee." Despite the tension, Sarah let out a surprised laugh. "You're joking. Right now, you're joking." "Humor helps," Margaret said. "Keeps your mind clear. Plus, we really are going to be fine. I've landed in much worse conditions." "Like what?" Rodriguez asked, unable to help himself. "Once landed an F-16 in a sandstorm so thick I couldn't see the runway until I was 20 feet off the ground. Another time brought in a B-52 with 3 engines out and the landing gear jammed. That one made the news. And there was the time in '91 when I had to put down a stealth prototype on a frozen lake in Alaska after both engines quit." The lake landing, Reeves's voice came through the radio, quiet with reverence. "That's when they gave you the call sign." Sarah looked up. "Call sign?" Margaret was silent for a moment, focused on the approach. They were at 800 feet now, the runway filling the windscreen ahead of them. But when she spoke, her voice was soft with memory. "They called me Widow 6, she said. "Because I flew aircraft that would have killed anyone else. Widowed the sky, they said. I flew the planes that should have made my husband a widower." "The Widow 6, Rodriguez breathed. "I've heard stories. I thought they were legends. Myths. Nobody could have actually." "They weren't myths," General Reeves cut in. "Colonel Chen was the best pilot the Air Force has ever produced. She flew missions that are still classified. Tested aircraft that don't officially exist. Saved more lives than we can count. And now she's about to do it again." Through the cockpit window, they could see the runway clearly now. Fire trucks lined both sides, lights flashing. Ambulances waited. Hundreds of people had gathered to watch. 500 feet, Sarah called out. "Airspeed 170. "Good," Margaret said. "Right where we need to be. Hawk 1, you still with me?" "Right on your wing, Colonel. You're looking good. Lined up perfect." 300 feet, Sarah continued. "Sync rate 700 feet per minute. Reducing power slightly," Margaret said, pulling the throttle back a fraction of an inch. The sync rate decreased to 500 feet per minute. "That's better." She could feel the plane fighting her. The damaged stabilizer wanted to pitch them nose down. The asymmetric thrust wanted to yaw them right. The gusting wind wanted to push them off course. But Margaret had fought worse opponents than physics. 100 feet, Sarah called. Her voice was steady now, professional, trusting. 50 feet. The runway was rushing up at them. Margaret's hands made tiny adjustments, keeping the nose up, keeping the wings level. 30 feet. 20. "Brace for impact," Margaret said into the intercom. The rear wheels hit first, slamming into the concrete at 170 knots with a violence that shook the entire aircraft. The landing gear struts compressed fully, then rebounded. For a terrifying second, it felt like they might bounce back into the air. But Margaret was ready. She cut the power completely and pushed forward on the yoke, forcing the nose gear down onto the runway. The additional weight stopped the bounce. All 3 sets of wheels were now on the ground, screaming as they tried to slow the aircraft from highway speed to 0. Reversers, Margaret ordered. Sarah deployed the thrust reverser on the good engine. The asymmetric reverse thrust tried to spin them off the runway, but Margaret was already compensating with the rudder pedals, steering with her feet as much as with her hands. The plane fishtailed slightly. 150 knots. 130.100. The brakes were heating up, on the verge of failure. Margaret could smell burning rubber even through the cockpit ventilation. But they were slowing. 80 knots. 60.40. Finally, blessedly, the aircraft rolled to a stop. They were still on the runway, still intact, still alive. For 3 seconds, nobody in the cockpit spoke. The only sound was the winding down of the remaining engine and the distant wail of approaching emergency vehicles. Then Rodriguez started laughing. It was the kind of laughter that comes when tension breaks, when fear releases, when you realize you're still alive despite everything. "We made it," he said, disbelieving. "You actually did it." Margaret's hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. She looked down at them, wrinkled, spotted with age, trembling slightly, and marveled at what they had just accomplished. "Yes," she said quietly. "We did." The cockpit door burst open and Patricia, the senior flight attendant, stood there with tears streaming down her face. "We're down," she said, her voice breaking. "Everyone's okay. Some minor injuries from the hard landing, but everyone is okay." Behind her, they could hear the sound of passengers crying, laughing, applauding. Someone started singing. Someone else was praying loudly. Emergency crews surrounded the aircraft. Fire trucks sprayed foam on the smoking engine. Paramedics rushed to the exits with stretchers and medical equipment. Air Force personnel were already establishing a perimeter. General Reeves's voice came through the radio one more time. "Coastal 447, that was the finest piece of flying I have witnessed in 40 years of military service. Colonel Chen, on behalf of everyone at McCord Air Force Base, welcome home." "Thank you, Marcus," Margaret said. "It's good to be home." She unbuckled her harness and tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't quite support her. Rodriguez caught her arm. "Easy, Colonel. You've earned a rest." "I'm fine," she protested. "Just a little stiff." But she wasn't fine. The adrenaline crash was hitting her hard. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably now, and she felt lightheaded. Sarah grabbed her other arm, and together they helped her out of the captain's seat. The passengers were evacuating down the emergency slides, standard procedure after any emergency landing. But as Margaret made her way slowly toward the front of the aircraft, moving past row after row of empty seats, the few passengers still waiting their turn to evacuate started to realize who she was. "That's her," someone whispered. "That's the pilot who landed us." An older man, maybe 70 himself, with military bearing and a Marine Corps tattoo on his arm, snapped to attention as she passed. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. Thank you for my life." Margaret paused and met his eyes. "Thank you for your service, Marine." A young mother holding a toddler reached out and touched Margaret's hand. "My daughter," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You saved my daughter." Margaret squeezed her hand gently. "She's beautiful. You take care of her." By the time Margaret reached the forward door, word had spread among the passengers on the ground. As she appeared at the top of the slide, still supported by Rodriguez and Sarah, a cheer went up from the crowd. "That's her. That's the pilot. The old lady who saved us." Margaret slid down the inflatable slide, her cardigan flying up, her sensible shoes hitting the tarmac with a soft thud. She stumbled slightly, still unsteady, but Rodriguez was right behind her, helping her to her feet. The passengers surrounded her. People were crying, trying to hug her, thank her, touch her as if she were some kind of miracle. Airport security and Air Force personnel tried to maintain order, but the crowd was too large, too emotional. A path opened through the crowd, and General Marcus Reeves strode forward. He was in his 60s now, gray at the temples but still ramrod straight. When he reached Margaret, he stopped and rendered a crisp, perfect salute. "Colonel Margaret Chen," he said formally. "On behalf of the United States Air Force and the 147 souls aboard Coastal Flight 447, I salute you." Margaret, even in her exhausted state, returned the salute. Old habits die hard. Then Reeves broke into a broad smile and pulled her into a bear hug. "Maggie," he said, using the nickname only old friends were allowed. "You magnificent, crazy, impossible woman. When they told me you were on that plane, I knew everything would be okay. Because you're the Widow 6. Death himself can't catch you." "I'm getting too old for this, Marcus," Margaret said, but she was smiling. "Nonsense. You'll be flying circles around us when you're 90. The two F-18 pilots had landed and taxied over. They climbed out of their cockpits and jogged over, still in their flight suits, helmets under their arms. The lead pilot, a woman in her early 30s with captain's bars on her shoulder, stopped in front of Margaret and saluted. "Colonel Chen, I'm Captain Jennifer Hawk Morrison." "Ma'am, that was an honor to witness. They teach us about you in flight school. The Widow 6 incidents are part of our curriculum. But seeing you fly in person..." She shook her head in wonder. That was something else entirely. Margaret felt a surge of emotion. "They teach about me?" "Yes, ma'am, required reading. Your emergency procedures manual is still in use. Your techniques have saved dozens of aircraft over the years." Captain Morrison grinned. "Though I have to admit, most of us thought the stories were exaggerated. Nobody could be that good. But you are." News helicopters were circling overhead now, filming everything. A CBS News van screeched to a halt at the perimeter, and reporters scrambled out with cameras and microphones. "Colonel Chen," one of them shouted. "Can you tell us what happened up there?" General Reeves stepped between Margaret and the reporters. "Colonel Chen has just landed a crippled aircraft and saved 147 lives. She'll give a statement when she's ready. For now, give her some space." But Margaret touched his arm. "It's okay, Marcus. They deserve to know." She turned to face the cameras. Even exhausted, with her hair disheveled and her cardigan askew, she had a presence that commanded attention. "My name is Colonel Margaret Chen, United States Air Force, retired. Today, Flight 447 experienced a catastrophic engine failure followed by structural damage to the horizontal stabilizer. Captain Rodriguez and his crew did everything correctly. They declared an emergency, diverted to the nearest suitable runway, and accepted assistance when it was offered. The outcome was a team effort. The captain, the co-pilot, the flight attendants, the air traffic controllers, the fighter escort, and yes, me. We all worked together, and that's why everyone survived." "But Colonel," a reporter called out, "passengers are saying the captain didn't believe you at first. That the crew dismissed you because of your age." Margaret's expression hardened slightly. The captain was dealing with an emergency situation. He responded appropriately given the information he had. Age and appearance can be deceiving. I look like someone's grandmother because I am someone's grandmother. I'm also a combat veteran with 40,000 flight hours. Both things can be true. Derek, the young flight attendant who had initially dismissed Margaret's warnings, pushed through the crowd. His face was red and splotchy from crying. "Colonel Chen," he said, his voice breaking. "I need to apologize. You tried to warn me. You told me exactly what was going to happen, and I didn't listen. I thought you were just a nervous old woman. I almost got everyone killed because I was too arrogant to listen." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. The cameras were rolling. Everyone was watching. She could destroy this young man with a single word. Instead, she stepped forward and put her hand on his shoulder. "Derek," she said gently. "You did your job the way you were trained. You tried to keep passengers calm and seated during turbulence. You followed protocol. The problem isn't with you. The problem is with a system that teaches people to dismiss knowledge based on how it's packaged. You'll be a better flight attendant now. You'll listen more carefully. And you'll remember that expertise doesn't always look the way you expect it to. Derek nodded, unable to speak. Margaret gave his shoulder a squeeze and turned away. The businessman who had been sitting next to Margaret pushed through the crowd. He was still shaking. I need to say something, he announced to the cameras. I sat next to this woman for 20 minutes. I never spoke to her. Never looked at her. She was just, invisible to me. Another old person taking up space. And then she saved my life. She saved all our lives. I'm ashamed of how I thought about her, and I'm grateful beyond words that she was on that plane. The college student with the earbuds spoke up too. I had my music on. I was in my own world. I didn't even notice her until she stood up and started talking about engines and hydraulics. I thought she was crazy. But she knew. She knew everything that was going to happen. She tried to warn us, and we didn't listen because we judged her. We saw an old woman and assumed she didn't know anything. How many other people do we ignore every day because we make the same stupid assumptions? One by one, passengers came forward with similar stories. The man with the marine tattoo, the young mother. A teenager who admitted she'd been filming Margaret on her phone, planning to mock her on social media for being a nervous old lady. She had deleted the video, she said, crying. I was going to make fun of her, the teenager sobbed. I was going to post it with laughing emojis. And she saved my life. She's a hero, and I almost made her into a joke. Margaret listened to all of this with a mix of emotions. Sadness at how quickly people had dismissed her. Frustration at a society that made elderly people invisible. But also hope, because these people were learning. They were changing. Maybe their experience would ripple outward. Captain Rodriguez had been standing to the side, trying to stay out of the spotlight. But now he stepped forward. I need to say something too, he announced. His voice was steady but his eyes were red. Colonel Chen tried to warn me. She told me exactly what was wrong with my aircraft. She gave me specific technical details that later proved to be accurate. And I dismissed her. Not because she was wrong, but because she didn't look like someone who should know about aircraft systems. He turned to face Margaret directly. I'm a good pilot. I've got 3,000 hours in the 737. I've been flying for 15 years. But I'm not good enough to have landed that plane today. Not with that damage. I would have tried. I would have done my best. But we would have crashed. Of that, I have no doubt. His voice cracked. You saved 147 lives today, Colonel. But you also saved my career, my reputation, and my soul. Because I would have carried those deaths with me forever. I owe you everything. Margaret stepped forward and embraced him. You made the hardest decision a captain can make, she said softly. You put aside your ego and accepted help. That takes more courage than anything I did today. You're going to be a better pilot because of this. Trust me. Rodriguez nodded against her shoulder, unable to speak. General Reeves had called for a medical team, and they arrived with a stretcher. Margaret protested, I'm fine, I just need to sit down, but they insisted on checking her over. Blood pressure elevated but not dangerously so. Heart rate normal. No injuries. Just exhaustion and adrenaline crash. They brought her a chair and a bottle of water. She sat gratefully, suddenly aware of how much her legs ached, how tired she was. She was 72, after all, not 32. A young airman approached hesitantly. Colonel Chen. We've set up a satellite phone for you. Your family has been calling. The news is everywhere. Margaret took the phone. Her hands were steadier now, though still not quite right. She dialed a number she knew by heart. Mom. Her daughter's voice, nearly hysterical with relief. Mom, oh my God, are you okay? They're saying you landed a plane, that there was an engine failure, that you saved everyone. I'm fine, sweetheart. I'm perfectly fine. You said you were going to Florida for a vacation. To see the gardens. Not to land a crashing airplane. It wasn't crashing, Margaret corrected gently. It was just experiencing some technical difficulties. Mom. Her daughter was laughing and crying at the same time. This is not funny. I've been watching the news for an hour. There's footage of the plane landing. It looked terrifying. It was a bit rough, Margaret admitted. But we're all safe. Everyone made it. The news is calling you the Widow 6. They're saying you're a legend. Mom, why didn't you ever tell us about this? About what you did in the Air Force? Margaret was quiet for a moment. Because that was a different life, honey. A different person. I'm just your mom now. Just a retired pilot who grows tomatoes and complains about the neighbor's tree blocking my sun. You're not just anything, her daughter said fiercely. You're amazing. You've always been amazing. We just didn't know how much. Grandma. A younger voice took over the phone. Grandma, is it true? You flew fighter jets. Margaret smiled. Her grandson, Tommy, 12 years old and obsessed with airplanes. Yes, Tommy. I did. Mom says you were a test pilot. That you flew experimental planes. Why didn't you ever tell me? I asked you so many times about flying and you just said you flew a little bit in the service. I didn't want to brag, Margaret said. Brag? Grandma, I did a report on test pilots last year. I could have interviewed you. You could have been my primary source. My report got a B- because Mr. Henderson said I didn't have enough first-hand accounts. Despite everything, Margaret laughed. I'm sorry about your B-. I don't care about the grade, Tommy said, and his voice turned serious. I care that you're okay. Mom was crying. She thought you were going to die. I wasn't going to die, Tommy. I knew exactly what I was doing. Because you're a badass, Tommy said, then quickly added, sorry, I'm not supposed to say that word. Just this once, I'll allow it, Margaret said, smiling. When you come home, will you tell me about it? About all of it? The fighter jets and the experimental planes and how you learned to fly with broken instruments. I'll tell you everything, Margaret promised. Every story, every flight. Everything I remember. Cool. Super cool. I love you, Grandma. I love you too, Tommy. As Margaret ended the call, a group of men in suits approached. FAA investigators. They were polite but professional, asking if she felt well enough to give a preliminary statement. The engine failure was exactly as I predicted, Margaret told them. Compressor blade fatigue in the third stage. The vibration signature was unmistakable. When the blade failed, the debris punctured the horizontal stabilizer and severed hydraulic lines. The damage made normal landing procedures impossible. The lead investigator, a man named Harrison with gray hair and skeptical eyes, was taking notes. Ms. Chen. Colonel, General Reeves interjected. Colonel Chen. Colonel Chen, Harrison corrected himself. How did you know about the compressor blade issue before it failed? I felt the vibration pattern. I've experienced similar failures 3 times in my career. The frequency and interval are distinctive. Once you felt it, you never forget it. And your recommendation to switch to backup hydraulics? The hydraulic routing on this generation of 737 makes the rudder system vulnerable to engine debris. It's a known design limitation. I helped document it in the 1990s. When I saw the damage location, I knew the main hydraulic system would fail. It was just a matter of time. Harrison exchanged glances with his colleagues. "Colonel, you're going to be very valuable to our investigation. Would you be willing to consult with us?" "Of course," Margaret said. "Whatever you need. There's also going to be questions about the decision to have you take control of the aircraft. Captain Rodriguez technically violated several regulations by allowing an uncertified, non-current passenger to occupy the captain's seat." Margaret's expression hardened. Captain Rodriguez made the correct decision under emergency circumstances. He recognized that I had specific expertise relevant to the situation, and he utilized available resources to ensure the safety of his passengers. That's exactly what a good captain should do. If your investigation tries to punish him for that, you'll have to go through me first. Harrison held up his hands. "I'm not suggesting any wrongdoing. Just that there will be questions, politics and regulations and all that." "Let them ask their questions," Margaret said. "I'll answer them." While Margaret was being interviewed, the story was exploding across social media. The teenager who had almost mocked Margaret had instead posted the full story, including her own admission of bias and prejudice. It had been shared 10,000 times in an hour. #Widow6 was trending worldwide. Videos of the landing, filmed by passengers and by news helicopters, were racking up millions of views. People were digging through military archives, finding old photos of Margaret in her flight suit, standing in front of aircraft that were still partially classified. A retired Air Force general appeared on CNN. "The Widow 6 was a legend when I was coming up through the ranks," he said. "She flew missions nobody else would touch. Tested aircraft that had already killed other pilots. She had an instinct for flying that bordered on supernatural. And apparently, she still does." On Twitter, stories were pouring in from other people who had encountered Margaret over the years and never known who she was. "A barista in Seattle, she came into my coffee shop every morning. Always ordered the same thing, always tipped well, always said please and thank you. I never knew I was serving coffee to a hero. A librarian, she volunteered at our library, reading to children. The kids loved her. She had this way of making even the boring books exciting. One time a kid asked if she'd ever been in an airplane. She just smiled and said, once or twice. Once or twice." Margaret's neighbors were being interviewed. "She was just Maggie," one said. "Nice lady. Brought us cookies at Christmas, helped jumpstart my car once. I thought she was just a retired teacher or something. We had no idea." The CEO of Coastal Airlines arrived at McCord in a private jet. She was a sharp-featured woman in her 50s named Catherine Brennan, and she made a beeline for Margaret. "Colonel Chen," she said, extending her hand. "Catherine Brennan. I'm the CEO of Coastal Airlines. I want to personally thank you for what you did today. You saved 147 lives, including 23 crew members. You also saved my airline from a catastrophic disaster that would have destroyed us." "I just did what needed to be done," Margaret said. "It was more than that. Much more." Brennan paused. "I also want to apologize. Our crew initially dismissed your warnings. They didn't take you seriously because of your age and appearance. That represents a massive failure in our training and our culture. We're going to fix that." "How?" Margaret asked. "First, we're implementing mandatory training on unconscious bias for all crew members. Second, we're establishing a protocol for evaluating passenger warnings based on content, not on who's delivering them. Third, I'd like to hire you as a consultant to help us develop these programs." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "I'm 72 years old. I'm retired. You're 72 years old and you just landed a crippled aircraft that would have killed everyone on board. You're exactly who we need." Brennan smiled. "Plus, I suspect you're not quite ready to go back to just growing tomatoes. Are you?" Margaret thought about it. Her quiet life, her garden, her books, her routine. It had been peaceful. Comfortable, safe. And boring. I'll consider it, she said. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the runway, more people arrived. Old colleagues from Margaret's Air Force days. Test pilots she had flown with. Engineers she had worked with on classified projects. A man in his 70s with a prosthetic leg approached, using a cane. Maggie Chen, he said, shaking his head. I heard the Widow 6 was flying again. I told my wife it couldn't be true. You promised me you were retiring. Hanging up your wings, growing old gracefully. Frank. Margaret stood and embraced him. How have you been? Better than you, apparently. I've managed to stay on the ground for the past 13 years. Frank Wagner had been her co-pilot on several test flights, including the infamous Frozen Lake landing. Though I hear you've still got the touch. That landing looked rough on the footage. It was rough. But we made it. You always make it, Frank said. That's your thing. The Widow 6 doesn't lose. Not to mechanical failures, not to enemy fire, not to impossible odds. And apparently not to age, either. They talked for a while, swapping stories about the old days. About flights that went wrong and missions that should have been impossible. About aircraft that existed only in classified files and runways that weren't on any map. Other former colleagues joined them. Soon there was a whole group of retired pilots and engineers, all in their 60s and 70s, all with stories about Margaret. The time she landed a plane with no hydraulics. The time she flew through a thunderstorm that grounded every other aircraft. The time she talked a terrified student pilot through an emergency when his instructor had a heart attack. You saved that kid's life, one of the engineers said. He was going to crash. Everyone who heard that radio transmission knew it. But you stayed on the radio with him for 45 minutes, coaching him through every step. Your voice never wavered. Never showed fear. You gave him confidence when he had none. Margaret had forgotten about that flight. It had been 20 years ago, maybe more. What happened to him, she asked. He's an airline captain now. Flies for Delta. He named his daughter Margaret. General Reeves organized a formal press conference in one of the base hangars. By the time it started, there were hundreds of reporters and cameras from around the world. Margaret sat at a table on a raised platform, flanked by General Reeves, Captain Rodriguez, and the CEO of Coastal Airlines. The pre-flight checks had become a media event. Colonel Chen, a reporter from the New York Times asked, "You've been retired for 13 years. What was it like to fly again after so long?" Margaret considered the question. Like breathing, she said finally. You don't forget how to breathe. Flying was always part of me. It still is. I thought I had left it behind, but apparently it never left me. Do you think you would have taken the controls if you hadn't felt the initial vibration? If the engine had failed without warning? No, Margaret said honestly. I would have stayed in my seat. I would have trusted the crew to handle it. But I felt something they couldn't feel. I had knowledge that could help. In that situation, staying silent would have been wrong. There's been a lot of discussion on social media about ageism, another reporter said. About how the crew initially dismissed you because of your age. Do you think that's a widespread problem? Yes, Margaret said bluntly. Not just in aviation. Everywhere. Society treats elderly people as if we're obsolete. As if our experience and knowledge became worthless the moment we retired. But expertise doesn't have an expiration date. Skills don't disappear just because you have gray hair. We're invisible until we're needed, and then everyone acts surprised that we're still capable. She leaned forward. I'm not special. There are millions of people my age with incredible skills and knowledge. We're your neighbors, your relatives, the people you pass on the street without seeing. We're veterans and engineers and doctors and teachers. We've lived full lives. We've survived things you can't imagine. And we're still here, still capable, still valuable. Maybe it's time people started seeing that. The room was silent. Then, from the back, someone started clapping. Others joined in. Soon the entire room was applauding. After the press conference, General Reeves walked Margaret to a quiet office where she could rest before flying home to Seattle, this time as a passenger on a properly functioning aircraft. "You know what's going to happen now," Reeves said. "You're famous. The whole world knows who you are. Your quiet retirement is over." Margaret sighed. "I know. Is that okay?" She thought about it. "I don't know. I liked being invisible. It was peaceful. But maybe I was too invisible. Maybe I was hiding. I retired young, Marcus. I was 59. I could have kept flying for years. But after the last classified mission, after the plane that wouldn't make it into the history books, I was tired. Tired of the secrets, tired of the danger, tired of being one of the only women in a world of men who didn't always want me there." "They respected you," Reeves protested. "Eventually, after I proved myself 100 times over. But it was exhausting. So I retired. I disappeared. I became just another grandmother. And part of me was relieved. And now." Margaret smiled. "Now I remember why I loved flying. Not the danger. Not the adrenaline. But the feeling of doing something impossible and making it possible. Of using skills that took decades to develop. Of mattering. I forgot what that felt like." Reeves nodded. "For what it's worth, you always mattered. Even when you were just growing tomatoes. Thank you, Marcus." Late that evening, Margaret boarded a Coastal Airlines flight back to Seattle. The airline had offered her first class, but she declined. "Put me in coach," she said. "I'm just a passenger like everyone else." But when she boarded, something remarkable happened. The passengers recognized her. Word had spread that the Widow 6 was on their flight. As she walked down the aisle to her seat, 14C again, middle seat, every single passenger stood up and applauded. Some were crying. Others were smiling. All of them were honoring her. Margaret felt tears prick her own eyes. She nodded to them, acknowledging their gratitude, and made her way to her seat. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Amanda Richardson. I have the extraordinary honor of having Colonel Margaret Chen on board with us tonight. Colonel, if you're listening, I just want you to know that you're the reason I became a pilot. When I was 16 years old, I read about you in a magazine article. They called you the Widow 6. They said you were the best pilot in the Air Force. And I thought, if she can do it, maybe I can too." The captain's voice caught. "You were my hero then. You're my hero now. Thank you for everything you've given to aviation, to this country, and to all of us who followed in your footsteps. It's an honor to fly you home." Margaret wiped her eyes. The businessman next to her, a different businessman this time, offered her a tissue. "Thank you," she said softly. "No, ma'am," he replied. "Thank you." When the plane landed in Seattle, Margaret expected to deplane quietly and catch a cab home. Instead, when she exited the jetway into the terminal, she found a crowd waiting. Her daughter was there, and her son, and Tommy, and grandchildren she hadn't seen in months. Behind them were more people. Strangers holding signs. "Thank you, Widow 6. Heroes don't retire. Age is just a number." Margaret stopped, overwhelmed. Tommy broke free from his mother and ran to her, throwing his arms around her waist. "Grandma! You're famous. You're on TV everywhere. Kids at school saw the videos and they were asking if you're really my grandma, and I said yes, and they didn't believe me, but then I showed them the picture of us and they were like, 'Whoa, your grandma is so cool,' and I was like, 'I know.'" Margaret laughed, hugging him tight. "I'm just the same grandma I've always been. No, her daughter said, joining them. You're not. Or maybe you are, and we just never really saw you. Mom, why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you share this part of your life? Because I thought it was over, Margaret said honestly. I thought that person, the pilot, the colonel, she was gone. I was just trying to be present in this life. To be your mother, their grandmother. To be enough without the flying. You've always been enough, her son said, his voice thick. You've always been more than enough. We just wish we'd known how extraordinary you were. You are extraordinary, a voice said from behind them. Margaret turned. It was the young mother from Flight 447, the one with the toddler. She was holding her daughter, who was clutching a stuffed airplane. I needed to see you again, the mother said. I needed to thank you properly. You gave me more time with my baby. You gave her a chance to grow up. How do I even begin to thank you for that? Margaret reached out and touched the little girl's cheek. You raise her well. You tell her that she can do anything. You teach her not to judge people by how they look, but by what they know and what they can do. That's thanks enough. 3 months later, Margaret stood in front of 200 flight attendants at a Coastal Airlines training facility. She was wearing a sensible blazer now, professional but comfortable. Her reading glasses were perched on her nose as she reviewed her notes. Today we're going to talk about listening, she began. Not just hearing, but truly listening. Because on Flight 447, several crew members heard me but didn't listen. They heard words but dismissed them because they didn't like the package they came in. She clicked to a slide showing the damaged engine from the flight. This engine was failing for 20 minutes before it actually exploded. 20 minutes where the lives of 147 people hung in the balance. 20 minutes where a passenger was trying to warn you, but you couldn't hear her through your biases. The room was silent. These flight attendants had all been through the revised training. They knew the story. But hearing it from Margaret herself was different. I'm not here to blame anyone, Margaret continued. I'm here to make sure this never happens again. Not just engine failures. But the failure to recognize expertise when it doesn't look the way you expect, because the next time, the person trying to warn you might not have 40,000 flight hours. They might be a doctor, an engineer, a mechanic. They might be young or old, male or female, any race, any background. And if you dismiss them because they don't fit your mental image of what an expert looks like, people will die. She paused. Age brings experience. Gray hair means we survived. Wrinkles mean we lived. And sometimes, just sometimes, the little old lady in seat 14C knows something you need to hear. After the presentation, a young flight attendant approached her. Colonel Chen. I just want you to know, your story changed my life. I was planning to quit. I felt invisible, overlooked, like I didn't matter. But you showed me that everyone matters. Everyone has value. Everyone deserves to be heard. Margaret smiled. What's your name? Sarah. Sarah Martinez. Well, Sarah Martinez, you do matter. Your job matters. Every person you serve matters. Don't forget that. 6 months after the incident, Margaret stood in her garden, checking on her tomatoes. They were thriving this year, fat and red and perfect. She plucked one and bit into it, savoring the warm sweetness. Her phone buzzed. A text from Tommy, Grandma, did you see the news? They're making a movie about you. They're calling it, The Widow 6. That's so cool. Margaret smiled and texted back, let's hope they cast someone who actually looks like a pilot, smiley face. She put her phone away and went back to her tomatoes. The movie would happen or it wouldn't. The fame would fade or it wouldn't. But the garden was real. The soil in her hands was real. The warm sun on her face was real. And inside her house, on the mantel, sat a new addition to her collection of photos. It was from the ceremony at McCord, showing her shaking hands with General Reeves. Behind them, the damaged 737 sat on the runway, surrounded by emergency vehicles. Next to it was an older photo, faded with age. A much younger Margaret in a flight suit, standing in front of an F-16, her expression confident and fierce, the woman who became the Widow 6. They were the same person. They had always been the same person. She had just forgotten for a while. But she remembered now. Her daughter called from the house. "Mom! Captain Rodriguez is here. He brought his kids to meet you." Margaret wiped the soil from her hands and headed inside. Rodriguez visited every few months now, usually bringing his family. He was flying again, better than ever, he said. More humble. More willing to listen. The incident had changed him. It had changed everyone. As she walked into her house, Margaret caught a glimpse of herself in the hallway mirror. Gray hair, reading glasses. 72 years old. She smiled at her reflection. Age had made her invisible. Experience had made her invaluable. And on one terrifying afternoon at 30,000 feet, the world had finally seen what her family, her friends, and she herself had known all along. The Widow 6 had never stopped flying. She had just been waiting for the right moment to spread her wings again.